His body began to decompose while he was still alive. In early August of the 15th century, when the air in Rome was heavy and humid, the first stench appeared in the chambers of Pope Alexander VI, which could not be explained by uncleanliness or heat. The servants, who at first attributed it to accidentally spilled oil, began to notice in the following days that the smell was coming from the Supreme Pontiff himself, whose skin on his chest and stomach was covered with reddish spots and whose breath had become foul. Contemporaries wrote that his bones seemed to be poisoned. At night he cried out to Christ, but his words were more like delirium than prayer, noted the Venetian ambassador, who saw the Pope in the first weeks of his illness, in a report. Alexander was over 70. He had ruled longer than many and kept Rome in an iron grip, relying on his sons and nephews, bribing and executing, distributing land and offices. But power gained through cunning and blood did not save him from internal decay. The doctors who were called to him ordered bloodletting. They opened the veins in his arms and legs, struggling to hold up his body, which was no longer obedient. The blood was thick and dark, mixed with pus. After the procedure, my father fell into a stupor, and when he came to, he demanded wine, which made his stomach swell even more. Servants recalled that he moaned at night, scratched his skin until it bled, and said that demons were sitting at his bedside. With each passing day, the room turned into a chamber of decay. The smell became so strong that the guards at the door began to cover their faces with cloth soaked in vinegar. The court physicians rubbed his body with ointments made of sulfur, mercury, and herbs, but this only intensified the burning sensation and caused his skin to crack. His flesh was like warm bread that tears with your fingers, wrote one Roman chronicler later, based on the accounts of servants. During those weeks, fear of God's judgment began to torment Alexander more than the pain. He demanded continuous worship in his own chapel, although he could not get out of bed. The priests read prayers, but noticed that the pontiff would nod in agreement, then suddenly fly into a rage, accusing them of treason and heresy. Some accounts claim that he ordered one of the cardinals to swear allegiance under threat of defrocking right at his bedside. The dying man trusted no one, not even his own children, suspecting them of plotting to seize the throne and the treasures. Meanwhile, outside the walls of the papal chambers, Rome was seething with intrigue. The Spanish faction, supported by his son Cesare Borgia, was trying to maintain its position. The Italian cardinals saw his illness as a sign of impending collapse, and the ambassadors of the northern powers were already writing in their reports about the imminent fall of papal power. If Alexander dies in these days, noted a French observer, the throne of St. Peter will become the prey of the strongest, and blood will be shed in the corridors of the apostolic palace. The servants tried to hide the Pope's true condition. No outsiders were allowed to see him. The doors were guarded day and night, and those who tried to pass messages outside the walls were punished silently and cruelly. Reports indicate that several scribes and a young assistant to the apothecary were secretly taken away and never returned. Thus, a deafening silence fell around the dying man's bed, filled only with moans and gasps. As his condition worsened, the doctors resorted to new measures. He was given opium and wine to ease the excruciating pain in his stomach and joints. Sometimes this brought brief relief, and Alexander was able to give orders again. But almost immediately his speech became incoherent, He talked about angels demanding an account from him for the heretics who had been executed, and called out the name of his deceased mistress. The letters of one of the monastery abbots contain a description of the night when the Pope ordered the windows to be opened, even though the heat was unbearable, and shouted that the walls were closing in on him and wanted to crush him. 4 men held him back as he tore at his clothes and tried to run out into the corridor. After this attack, he was locked up and not even allowed out during the day, for fear that rumors would reach the people. Meanwhile, the palace advisors argued over the inheritance, gold, paintings, land deeds. All of this became the subject of a secret division even during the master's lifetime. Each of his close associates understood that the pontiff's death could mean the end of their own positions. The question of Cesare was particularly acute, as his military power kept half of Italy in fear. Without his father, his power was crumbling. And the weaker the Pope became, the more furious the secret negotiations behind his back became. By the end of August, his body was almost motionless. His legs were swollen and covered with sores, from which a cloudy liquid oozed. His breathing became hoarse, his tongue was parched, and his eyes sometimes rolled back so that only the whites were visible. The servants who changed his bandages and sheets later wrote that the fabric had to be thrown away because the smell had permeated it forever. One of them said during interrogation, "When I took out the sheet, it felt like I was holding a dead body, not a piece of cloth." All those days, Alexander demanded confession, but no priest dared to tell him directly about his sins. They read general prayers to him, although many knew that the Pope's repentance was superficial. He feared heaven more than he regretted his earthly deeds. Sometimes he begged for more time, 3 more days, 1 more week, as if bargaining for his soul. By mid-September, the smell in the Pope's chambers had become unbearable, even for those accustomed to illness and death. Servants burned incense and scattered frankincense on the floor, but the air remained thick and sticky, saturated with the sweetish stench of rotting flesh. According to reports from Spanish cardinals, entering the pontiff's bedroom was tantamount to subjecting oneself to torture. The guards at the door were changed every 2 hours, for no one could endure it any longer. Bubbles filled with fluid began to appear on his skin, which burst and left open sores. His body swelled so much that the rings on his fingers had to be cut off. He complained of a constant burning sensation and said that worms were crawling under his skin. The doctors tried to explain this with heat and bad blood, and resorted to bloodletting again. A murky, foul-smelling liquid flowed from his veins, and one of the doctors closed his eyes in horror, realizing that what he was seeing was not just a disease, but decay while still alive. The secretary's testimony has been preserved. He screamed so loudly that the walls shook and called for his son Cesare, demanding protection from invisible enemies. In moments of lucidity, Alexander tried to give orders. He demanded that new allies be made, threatened to excommunicate his enemies, and spoke of war as if he were still at the head of his court. But then he would immediately fall back into delirium, suspecting everyone of treason. Once he ordered the arrest of his own valet, claiming that he had poisoned him. The servant was beaten and thrown into a dungeon, where he died a few days later. The struggle for power reached its peak. Cesare Borgia, tired of his father's constant suspicions, demanded that the cardinals recognize his military authority. The Italian nobility saw the Pope's illness as a chance to get rid of Spanish influence. Secret reports from Milan stated, "Alexander's death is bringing about a redistribution of power throughout Italy. France and Spain are already preparing their people." The doctors did not give up. They rubbed his body with ointments made of vinegar, crushed garlic, and oil, trying to stop the decay. They gave him poppy seed decoctions to ease the pain. But the Pope only fell asleep for a short time, after which he woke up in a panic, screaming that the fires of hell had already licked his feet. His cries could be heard even in the courtyard, and once a group of pilgrims standing at the gate spread a rumor that my father had already died, and that the devil himself was ruling in his room. At night, according to one monk, Alexander began to have visions. He called out to his dead lovers, saying that they were standing next to him in white clothes and laughing. He claimed that angels were holding scales and placing his sins on one side. At the same time, he grabbed the cross in horror, kissed it, but immediately threw it away, shouting that the cross was burning his lips. The priests who were called to him tried to read psalms, but his father cried and swore, demanding that they be driven away. The decomposition had reached such a stage that even touching him caused bleeding sores. The servants wore gloves to change his bedding and increasingly refused to perform this service. Several people fled and were never found. Those who remained whispered that they slept in the hallway, unable to bring themselves to spend the night near his bed. One of them later revealed, "I saw the skin peel away from his face like a mask." By the middle of the month, Alexander had stopped getting up and hardly spoke. Only occasionally did he open his eyes and mumble incomprehensible words. His breathing became irregular, and each new breath sounded like a death rattle. It seemed that death was imminent, but his mutilated and decaying body still held on. This anticipation drove the courtiers mad. They lived in constant fear that he would either die or suddenly revive and seize power again. When the last week of September arrived, death could no longer hide behind the walls of the Vatican. Alexander VI lay motionless, his skin blackened, his eyes sunken, and his body continuing to swell. The smell became so heavy that the guards in the corridor changed not only the bandages on their faces, but also their own clothes every few hours. One of the servants confessed, "We stood nearby, and it felt like we were breathing the air of a tomb." On the evening of the 21st, the pontiff suffered a severe attack. He muttered incoherent words and tried to raise his hands, but they only trembled. The priests hurriedly began to read prayers, but he only moaned, shouted the names of the dead, and asked for water, which he could no longer drink. His tongue swelled, his breathing became hoarse, and each new breath was accompanied by a gurgling sound. It was the sound of a man drowning in his own juices, one of the doctors later wrote. By midnight, his body had stopped responding. His face was contorted, and with a final gasp, Alexander VI died. But death brought no peace. Almost immediately, what everyone feared began. The internal decay that had tormented him during his lifetime took over. The corpse began to swell, the skin cracked, and a foul-smelling liquid oozed from the wounds. Servants who tried to lay the body on the bed more decently reported that the abdomen swelled like a bag and burst with a loud noise. The cardinals gathered in the next room held their noses in handkerchiefs, but no one dared to enter. Only a few brave souls brought vinegar and resin to try to mask the stench. It was impossible to stay there for more than a few minutes, a Venetian observer noted in his report. Doctors tried to begin embalming, but the body was already in such a state that knives slid across the decomposing flesh. One of the surgeons later wrote, "We touched him, and the skin came off in pieces." Removing the body from the chambers was a torture in itself. The pallbearers could barely cope, as the smell made them faint. The sheet in which the body was wrapped was immediately soaked with blood and pus. On the way to the hall, where the funeral was being prepared, the liquid dripped onto the floor, leaving traces that had to be covered with lime. The crowd at the gate learned about this instantly. Rumors that the Pope had exploded spread throughout the city, and the people took it as a sign of God's curse. Meanwhile, a power struggle broke out in the halls of the Vatican. Cesare Borgia arrived at his father's body, but his position had weakened. Many cardinals had already agreed to support other candidates. "The death of the pontiff did not leave his son strong," wrote the Milanese ambassador. The division of property began, and chests of gold were carried out of the chambers before the body could even be buried. Attempts were made to embalm Alexander's body, but the heat and rapid decomposition made this impossible. The chronicles note that the embalmers were forced to work in masks made of cloth soaked in resin and vinegar, and many still fainted. Finally, the body was sewn up with coarse thread, stuffed with straw and lime to keep it from falling apart. But even so, it continued to decompose, and the smell spread throughout the palace. The people of Rome reacted to the Pope's death with grim jubilation. For some, it was a sign of retribution for his debauchery and greed. For others, the beginning of new misfortunes. In churches, people whispered that God had shown the decay of the church itself through the decay of its head. Priests speaking in the streets did not dare to openly accuse Alexander, but spoke of terrible examples sent by heaven. The death of Alexander VI was a turning point. His Borgia family lost its former power. Cesare was forced to seek support from foreign courts, and the cardinals began to prepare for a new conclave. Europe was waiting for change. Spain hoped to strengthen its position, France hoped to weaken its enemy, and the German lands saw a chance to strengthen the Reformation. Thus, the death of one man, who once held the fate of entire states in his hands, turned into a disgraceful spectacle of a rotting corpse, which became a symbol of the decline of power and faith. His life ended in filth and squalor, and the consequences shook Italy and the entire Catholic Church. After the hasty and undignified funeral of Alexander VI, the consequences of his death began to manifest themselves with terrifying speed. The pontiff's body was buried in the basilica, but only a few cardinals dared to attend the funeral service. Eyewitnesses recalled that the smell from the coffin could be smelled even during the service, and many priests held handkerchiefs to their faces. The people of Rome, gathered at the gates, were not silent. They loudly discussed that such an end could only befall someone who lived uncleanly. The Pope's death caused an instant split within the Curia. Cardinals who had feared Cesare Borgia's power just the day before now openly opposed him. His troops, which had previously inspired terror, were left without support. News of the pontiff's death led to desertion and betrayal. Letters from Florentine merchants noted, "The Borgia's servants began to sell his possessions for a pittance, not believing that he would remain in power." For several weeks, Rome resembled a battlefield. The townspeople looted the homes of the late Pope's associates, and the streets were filled with rumors of poisons, curses, and devilish deals that had led to Alexander's death. In the monasteries, it was repeated that his death was an open sign that the Lord had rejected the present church. The cardinals hastily convened a conclave. The atmosphere there was tense. Many already knew that none of the Borgia relatives would be able to take the throne. The Spanish party had lost its power, the Italian nobility had raised its head again, and the ambassadors of France and Spain were sending news to their kings about the chances of influencing the choice. During those days, Rome was waiting for a new pope, but at the same time, there was a feeling that the power of the papacy had weakened. Rumors of the exploding body spread throughout Europe faster than official news. In Paris, Milan, London, and Nuremberg, people said that the pontiff had rotted away while still alive, and this was taken as a sign from heaven. In Germany, Reformation preachers used these rumors as a weapon. Thus the church itself is rotting, and so will its false shepherds, they proclaimed. The medical records of the time contain the dry lines. The cause of the swelling of the body and its instantaneous decomposition is a high fever and bad blood that has accumulated in the intestines. But even doctors admitted that what they saw went beyond the limits of ordinary illness. One of them later wrote in a treatise, "We tried to hold back decay, but the Lord revealed to all the true condition of his flesh." Rome could not forget the smell of those days for a long time. Even months later, the stench lingered in the palace corridors, ingrained in the walls. Servants refused to sleep in the rooms where the Pope had died. Many said they heard rustling and moaning there, and only with the arrival of the new pontiff were the rooms reconsecrated. For the Borgia family, Alexander's death was the beginning of the end. Cesare, who tried to maintain his influence by force of arms, was soon forced to leave Rome. His opponents, whom his father had kept in fear, raised their heads, and his allies turned against him. Spanish ambassadors wrote, "Now the name Borgia sounds like a curse, but the most serious consequence was not for the family, but for the church itself. The reputation of the papacy was undermined. Europe saw that the supreme shepherd had died in filth and decay, that his power had not protected him from illness or disgrace. This became a symbol of the decay of the Catholic world." In the years that followed, it was these stories about the exploding pope that were used in the sermons of the reformers, in pamphlets and chronicles, where Alexander VI appeared not as a spiritual father, but as an image of decay and corruption. Over time, memories of the man himself, his actions, alliances, and speeches began to fade. Only his end remained in the forefront. Even those who had previously received favors from the Borgias tried to keep quiet about their past. Priests and monks increasingly cited Alexander's death as an example of divine punishment in their sermons. A few years later, new versions began to appear in the chronicles of various countries. Some wrote that the Pope had died from poison prepared by his own son. Others claimed that he had decomposed while still alive because his soul was already damned. In folk tales, the pontiff's body exploded in its coffin before the eyes of priests, and flames burst forth. The actual events no longer mattered. The image of the decaying pope had become a symbol. In Europe, this symbol fueled the reformers, giving them a weapon against Catholic authority. In Italy, it became a warning to every new pontiff that power without faith leads to disgrace. Even among the cardinals, many began to be more cautious about luxury and debauchery, although history soon repeated itself. Ordinary Romans who lived through that year told their children for a long time about the smell that hung over the Vatican. For them, it was more frightening than any sermon. "We knew that it was not just a man who was dying," wrote one of the townspeople in his diary. "We felt that the church itself was rotting." Thus, the death of Alexander VI was not the end of a single ruler, but the beginning of a new era, where every step of the papacy was accompanied by the shadow of his rotting body. Europe was entering an age of schisms, wars, and reforms, and the memory of the decomposing pontiff was an integral part of this new era.